There are cases that get closed not because the truth was found, but because finding it became inconvenient. In 2003, a 32-year-old British government weapons expert named David Kelly was found dead in the woods near his home in Oxfordshire, England. The official conclusion was suicide. The case was never formally tried in a coroner's court. No inquest was held. A special inquiry replaced the entire legal process, a move that hadn't happened in British history in over a century. The findings were sealed for 70 years. 70 years! Think about that for a moment. If someone dies alone in the woods and the conclusion is that they simply chose to end their life, why does the paperwork need to stay locked until the people who investigated it are all dead? That question has never been officially answered, and that may be where this story actually begins. David Kelly wasn't a political figure, not in the traditional sense. He didn't give speeches. He didn't run campaigns. He was a scientist. One of the most respected weapons experts in the world, a man who had personally supervised the dismantling of biological weapons programs in the Soviet Union after the Cold War. He had been inside Iraq's weapons facilities. He had seen what was there and, perhaps more importantly, what wasn't. He was the kind of person whose opinion on weapons of mass destruction carried more weight than almost anyone alive. In 2003, that opinion became dangerous because the British government, alongside the United States, was building the case for war in Iraq. And the central argument, the one placed before the public, before Parliament, before the world, was that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction that posed an imminent threat. That was the justification. That was the line that was supposed to make everything else acceptable. The problem was that people like David Kelly knew that line was shaky at best. In May of 2003, a BBC journalist named Andrew Gilligan reported that a senior government source, unnamed at the time, had told him that the intelligence dossier used to justify the war had been sexed up. That the claim about Iraq being able to deploy chemical or biological weapons within 45 minutes had been inserted into the document against the wishes of intelligence analysts. That the government knew the evidence was weak and published it anyway. The report caused an immediate political firestorm. The government denied everything. Aggressively, the Prime Minister's communications director, Alastair Campbell, launched a direct campaign against the BBC, demanding a retraction, demanding an apology, treating the story not as journalism to be challenged, but as an enemy to be destroyed. The pressure was extraordinary. And then David Kelly made a quiet, perhaps naive decision that would cost him everything. He told his supervisor that he had spoken to Gilligan, that he was likely the unnamed source. He believed apparently that transparency would protect him, that the truth, spoken quietly, would be enough. He was wrong. Within days, the Ministry of Defense confirmed to journalists, without ever actually saying his name, that a government scientist had come forward. The confirmation was structured in a way that made Kelly's identification almost inevitable. Reporters were told to submit names. If the name was correct, the spokesperson would say yes. It was a game, and Kelly was the piece being moved across the board without his knowledge. On July 9, 2003, David Kelly's name appeared in the press. He was 59 years old. He had spent decades in service to his country, working on some of the most sensitive and consequential intelligence operations of the late 20th century. And now, in the final chapter of his career, he was being publicly named as the man who had embarrassed the government. His colleagues described him as visibly shaken, hollowed out. A man who understood, perhaps better than anyone, what had just been set in motion. 4 days later, he went for a walk in the woods and didn't come back. His body was found on the morning of July 18, 2003 by a search team. He was lying against a tree. His left wrist had been cut. A blister pack of coproximol, a prescription painkiller, was found nearby, partly empty. The initial cause of death, later confirmed by the Hutton inquiry, was listed as hemorrhage from a severed ulnar artery, combined with heart disease and an ingestion of coproximol tablets. That was the official conclusion. And on the surface, it appeared to close the matter. But several medical professionals who reviewed the case, including consultant radiologist Dr. Stephen Coles and a group of doctors who formally petitioned the Attorney General, raised a series of concerns that were never adequately addressed. The first was about blood. When a person dies from a severed wrist artery, particularly from cutting an artery as relatively small as the ulnar, the loss of blood required to cause death is significant. The scene where Kelly was found contained far less blood than would be medically consistent with this cause of death. The vegetation around him, according to paramedics who arrived on scene, was described as dry, not soaked, not saturated. For a man who supposedly bled to death lying in the same position, the amount of blood present at the scene was noted by multiple first responders as surprisingly small. This was raised during the inquiry. It was not resolved. The second concern was about the tablets. Coproximol in quantities sufficient to contribute to death typically requires a high dose. The blister pack found near Kelly's body was partly empty, but the amount absorbed into his system, based on toxicology reports, was described as not at a level normally associated with causing death on its own. In the official conclusion, it was listed as a contributing factor alongside the wrist wound and pre-existing heart disease. But pathologists not involved in the case have since questioned whether the combination described was genuinely capable of producing death without other factors being present. The third concern was about the position of the body. Eyewitness accounts from the paramedics and police officers who arrived on scene described Kelly's body as being propped against a tree in a position that struck several of them as unusual for someone who had lost consciousness gradually from blood loss. Details about whether his watch was above or below the wound, the precise orientation of the knife, and the relative cleanliness of the scene were recorded and then, in several cases, appeared differently in formal testimony than in the original notes. These are not fringe observations from anonymous corners of the internet. They were compiled and submitted by licensed medical professionals to the UK's Attorney General with a formal request for a public inquest. That request was reviewed and denied. No coroner's jury has ever examined the death of David Kelly. Now, here is where the story changes. Because up to this point, what you have is a contested suicide. Sad, troubling, but perhaps not unprecedented. Whistleblowers have died under ambiguous circumstances throughout history. Institutions protect themselves. Investigations get shaped by politics. But in 2010, something emerged that forces a different question entirely. A group of researchers reviewing the Hutton Inquiry documentation discovered a specific anomaly in the classified material. It relates to the timeline of communications between Kelly and officials in the days immediately before his death. Specifically, it involves a meeting, not mentioned in the main body of the inquiry, that Kelly had attended on the morning of July 17, 2003, the day before his body was found. The meeting was with American officials. Exactly who was present, what was discussed, and what was said to Kelly in those final hours before he went for his walk remains, to this day, classified. That detail was not in the BBC coverage at the time. It was not prominently featured in the press. It appeared in a footnote of a declassified document release and was picked up by a small number of investigative journalists before largely disappearing from the public conversation. But think about what that means. David Kelly, a man already emotionally devastated by his public exposure, already under enormous institutional pressure, met with American officials on the last day of his life. Those communications are sealed. The content of that meeting is unknown, and the formal investigation into his death, an inquiry that replaced a proper inquest conducted under terms set by the government that had just publicly destroyed him, chose not to make that meeting a central line of inquiry. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a documented gap in the record. And documented gaps in cases involving people who know too much are not accidents. When you step back from the individual facts and look at the architecture of what happened, a pattern becomes visible. Kelly was identified by his own government in a way that was specifically designed to neutralize him without the government being directly accountable for naming him. He was exposed carefully, methodically, through a process that allowed officials to later claim they had never actually leaked his identity. The exposure itself was an act of institutional damage control, one that left Kelly destroyed in the press while the government maintained a posture of reluctant transparency. After his death, the decision to bypass a formal coroner's inquest in favor of a government-appointed inquiry was made with extraordinary speed. Lord Hutton was appointed within days. The scope, structure, and authority of the inquiry were controlled by the government. That was simultaneously the subject of the inquiry's most sensitive questions. And the inquiry ultimately concluded, in a finding that surprised many legal observers, that the BBC's journalism was more culpable than the government's behavior. The BBC's Director General and Chairman both resigned. Alastair Campbell declared victory. The government that had sexed up the intelligence dossier was cleared of serious wrongdoing by the same process it had designed to investigate itself. And the 70-year seal on the documents remains in place. The full record will not be available to the public until 2073. By then, every person who made every decision in this case will be dead. Every official who drafted every memo, attended every meeting, approved every step of what happened to David Kelly. All of them beyond accountability. All of them beyond the reach of any consequence. If that is how a suicide gets handled, with sealed records, replaced legal processes, and 70-year blackouts, then you have to ask yourself what kind of death would require more secrecy. Here is what this case reveals that extends far beyond David Kelly. The mechanisms used in this case: selective exposure, process replacement, classification as a tool of closure, are not unique to the UK government or to the Iraq War era. They are institutional instruments that appear in various forms whenever the risk of full transparency outweighs the political cost of managing that transparency. The logic is not complicated. It goes like this. If a proper legal process might produce findings that are impossible to control, you replace the process with one you can control. You call it something that sounds official. You give it authority that looks legitimate. And then you use the result to close the chapter before the chapter can close you. David Kelly knew things. He knew what was in the intelligence assessments. He knew what had been changed. He knew the difference between what the analysts believed and what the government published. And he had spoken to a journalist. In that context, his death, regardless of its true nature, solved a specific problem. Whether it was the tragedy of a broken man pushed beyond endurance by a government that used him and then exposed him, or something more deliberately engineered, the outcome was the same. The most dangerous witness to the Iraq intelligence deception was gone, and the investigation into his death was structured in a way that guaranteed the most sensitive questions would never reach a jury. There are people who have been trying to reopen this case for over 20 years. Former British Attorney General Lord Morris submitted formal letters. Medical professionals filed documented petitions. Investigative journalists pursued the classified material through Freedom of Information requests that were denied, appealed, and denied again. None of it has moved the needle. The political will to revisit David Kelly's death does not exist within the institutions that would need to authorize that revisit. And perhaps that is the most honest statement about how power manages inconvenient truths. It doesn't need to actively suppress them forever. It only needs to delay them long enough. Long enough for the moment to pass. Long enough for the public attention to move on. Long enough for the questions to feel historical rather than urgent. By 2073, David Kelly's death will be a footnote in a history most people already consider settled. Unless it isn't. Because here is the question that doesn't go away. If this case is exactly what the official record says it is, a suicide, tragic and uncomplicated, then why are the documents sealed for 70 years? What is in those files that requires the protection of time itself? Suicides don't get sealed for 70 years. Neither do straightforward deaths, clean investigations, or cases where the official account is solid enough to withstand scrutiny. Documents get sealed when they contain something that scrutiny might find, and we won't know what that something is until the people responsible for it are no longer alive to answer for it. That may be the most deliberate detail of all, because the evidence suggests that this case wasn't closed because the truth was found. It was closed because the truth was inconvenient. And the question that remains, the one that should stay with you, is not just what happened to David Kelly in those woods in 2003. The question is, how many other cases were closed the same way? How many other files are sitting in archives, sealed against a future none of us will live to see, holding answers to questions that were asked and then quietly, efficiently buried? Because if it happened once, with full media coverage, parliamentary attention, and the eyes of the world on it, then it happened with considerably less resistance in every case where nobody was watching. That's what makes this case matter. Not just what was hidden, but the proof that hiding it was possible.